Well, we will resume on this page 53. Basically, we are getting a complete description of the human state of consciousness. And at the same time, you will see that it is not a non-sympathetic description. That means he is not really very critical of the human weaknesses. Because you see, there could be an attitude of an author or a poet wherein he criticizes the human being because of his frailties, his limitations. But here, while Sri Aurobindo is giving us a picture of the human being, especially his incapacities and his limitation, we do feel there's a kind of a sympathy. Sri Aurobindo is giving us these descriptions more with an attitude of how to help him out. It's not just to denigrate man and saying he's useless, he's good for nothing and all that. So this is the objective analysis, we can say. He sees both the weaknesses and the strength of the human being, the present and the future of the human being, the capacities and the incapacity of the human being. So although we are going to get a long list of human frailties here, and then we take up a wonderful passage on the gods, where again he gives us a completely different understanding of who the gods are and what is their attitude toward the human beings. So let us see first the limitations of man. We had stopped at this line, if you find it out, a line where we say, identifying the world's mind with ours. Our range is fixed within the crowded arc of what we observe and touch and thought can guess, and rarely dawns the light of the unknown, waking in us the prophet and the seer. Well, of course, that's very clear and straightforward. Our range of vision, understanding, experience, everything is fixed within the crowded arc. It's a very beautiful description of the human consciousness, that in this full circle of knowledge, human beings occupy a small little arc of that knowledge. So it has a very beautiful connotation that our knowledge is part of the circle and yet it is only a small part. So you see, what is the small part? Is basically a knowledge based on senses. So in the full graph of the divine cosmic knowledge, the sense knowledge does occupy a place. So Sri Aurobindo is giving us the right place, or recognizes that this sense knowledge is useful, is valuable, But let us remember that it is only a very insignificant small arc, small portion of the full circle. So that's the meaning that comes out here. Our range is fixed within the crowded arc. Crowded is our experiences of sense knowledge. We are full with that experiences. So what is that experience? Of what we observe and touch and thought can guess. You see, we can't go beyond that. Our touch, what we see, what we touch, and what we interpret it as. And rarely dawns the light of the unknown, waking in us the prophet and the seer. Oftentimes this light of the unknown is the intuition. So lucky are those, rare are those people, those recipients, in whom comes this intuition, making us a prophet and a seer. Because you can imagine the prophet and the seer, their arc is much larger, their vision deeper, and of course is futuristic. The outward and the immediate are our field. The dead past is our background and support. Very simple, and he has been saying this many a time in this passage, that how all the time our consciousness is fixed with the outward and the immediate. I mean, man is anxious about the future, but he is not a prophet or a seer. So we are all the time engaged with the outward and the immediate. Mind keeps the soul prisoner. We are slaves to our acts. We cannot free our gaze to reach wisdom's sun. You see, it's very pathetic that how we think we are free, and that's the most ironic thing, that man has his greatest illusion that he is free. But he is a slave of two things. Slave of his own acts, because every act that he does, it binds him to a particular circumstance or a particular result. So the wheel moves on, the work, the act and the result and the result and the act. Each karma leads to the next karma. But the worst thing is, mind keeps the soul a prisoner. So we are not at all free in the sense that we are guided by our mind and the soul cannot express itself. We cannot free our gaze to reach wisdom's sun, inherited of the brief animal mind. Man, still a child in nature's mighty hands, in the succession of the moments lives. You see again the same thing, the outward and the immediate, the succession of the moments. So is all the time going from moment to moment, minute to minute. And the beautiful thing is given a description in the Vedas also, a reference to this, a child in nature's mighty hands. And in the Vedas we have a phrase called, man is an infant of a year. That means a baby of 1 year, an infant of a year. The same idea is there, a child in nature's mighty hands. So the evolution of man is still right at the baby stage, infant of a year, as if it's a 1 year old boy or 1 year old child. So you can imagine from this description given in the Vedas or by Sri Aurobindo, how much more progress we have yet to make. And so he says, that's this state of man. To a changing present is his narrow right. His memory stares back at a phantom past. The future flees before him as he moves. You see, it's a very pathetic situation where our future is like the changing horizon. As we move forward, the horizon moves forward, and then we live in our memories. And it's a memory which is a phantom past. You see, of course, you know the word phantom, which is bodiless, which is mysterious, which kind of non-existent. But for us, that past becomes such a stupendous, stark reality that we get stuck there. A lot of our consciousness is stuck in the past. All the time we think of the past, what we have done, what we could have done, what we did not do. And but that's what we are. He says, imagine garments, not a face. So again, is the incapacity of man. First of all, we see the garments, that means the outer face of the human being. But that too, sometimes we don't see the garments as they are. Because there's always a kind of a personal interpretation. You see, even when I say I am seeing, that seeing is also projected by your mental attitude. So that's why even the senses, although they are supposed to give you the factual reality, even the senses are not true, because that depends upon your mindset. Again, the way you want to look at things, so there the senses go wrong again. So we have, first of all, we see the garments, they are the imagined garments, and not a face, not the true face behind. Armed with a limited precarious strength, he saves his fruits of work from adverse chance. Yeah, that's the modern materialistic philosophy. He saves his fruits of work from adverse chance. We all try to save for the future. And whatever little we gain, we say, no, we should keep for that unknown future. We do not know what may happen. A struggling ignorance is his wisdom's mate. You see here, why is it a struggling ignorance? Yeah, there is a struggle to know the truth. There's an effort to see what is the true reality. And yet, because we try to seek the truth in a wrong place, in a wrong manner, so even our struggle to know the truth is again so much, prejudiced by, our eyes are covered with the mindset, the prejudices, the limitations. So even our search for the truth becomes somewhere a kind of a ignorant effort, ignorant in the sense is unsuccessful. Because there is no, as we would see in our philosophy, there is no openness, there is no open receptivity. We kind of want to see the truth the way we want to see it. So that kind of a mindset, each one of us, we have a particular mindset, and we say, no, I want to see, and that's what we begin to see. So this kind of a detachment, now I realize of course for me is the Gita. I'm sure many other saints and books have talked about it. But this question of not doing a thing with attachment, I suppose that's what gives you this openness, non-prejudice, a kind of an open mindset to receive the truth as it is. But the moment we are attached to the fruit of the work, then you will see our vision itself changes. So the great thing, what Sri Krishna tells you in the Gita, is the question of the Nishkama Karma. That is one of the most beautiful psychological advices given by Sri Krishna. Nishkama Karma, he says, do your work, but don't be attached. Nishkama, that means you don't have the desire for the fruit of the act. But act you must. That is your dharma, that's your duty, that the work given to you by the circumstances, by your guru, by your master, by your self-choice, it must be done to the full, but always see it is nishkama. Don't put a fruit, a result in front of your work and say, hey, this is what I got to achieve. You achieve the present, the future belongs to him. So he says, he waits to see the consequence of his acts, he waits to weigh the certitude of his thoughts. He knows not what he shall achieve or when. You see, really, I really feel it's such a ignorant effort that human beings make when we expect the fruit of our labor, the fruit of our work. Why is it an ignorant, useless effort? Because you see here, he waits to weigh the certitude of his thoughts. He knows not what he shall achieve or when. We have no idea, no clue of what's going to happen next day. I have put in my efforts, and we don't finish it there. We say, oh my God, I had expected that. It rebounds in you as depression, sadness, this and disappointment. And then this disappointment again leads to other disappointment. Because this is his incapacity. He waits to see the consequence of his acts. He weighs the certitudes of his thoughts. He knows not what he shall achieve or when. Reading this, I remember once Mona Sarkar was talking to the mother, and he was pretty certain of what is going to happen next. I mean, in his planning, he was telling the mother something. And I don't remember the exact words, but he says, Mother, this is what will happen and we will do that. And mother was not, I won't use the word angry, but she teased him saying, what? You think you will know, you know what you are going to do next? You don't know what is there on your nose itself. How can you think of the next day and what is going to happen to the fruit? So she really came strong on him to say, human beings are so ignorant, so limited. So don't plan for the future, don't expect what all Sri Aurobindo is saying. Don't do that. Or end like the man. He knows not whether at last he shall survive, or end like the mastodon and the sloth, and perish from the earth where he was king. For this you know, because in nature a lot of mastodons and sloths have come, and nature has put them in the dustbin of time. Why? We say dinosaurs were too big and all that. It's not just because of the size. They're huge animals, but earth is big enough to have all of them. But nature had to withdraw them basically because they could not contain the new consciousness of the mind. It's not the hugeness that was the defect. The defect of these mastodons was that they were not open to the mental consciousness. So that's why it rejects the whole species of animals. And so Sri Aurobindo also warned somewhere, if man is not open to the new consciousness, he too may be pushed on the roadside. So he was in 1969, the mother had a talk in her class, not 69, some other earlier times, where people do discuss, because Sri Aurobindo had given a warning that if humanity itself will survive. In fact, he had said that if it is not ready to be spiritualized, humanity may be withdrawn. So that is the necessity of being open to the next. And if we are not open, he says, we are not sure if we are going to survive. He is ignorant of the meaning of his life. He is ignorant of his high and splendid fate. Now from here, we have a sudden switch in the whole theme. But the theme which is connected to this condition of man, you see, because of this helpless situation, our weakness and all that, we had to depend on somebody. We need the help of somebody. Because we are ourselves so limited, so incapacitated. And for this help, we sought the gods. So that was the necessity of the Godhead, right from the beginning of our civilization, where he needed somebody to hold his hand and pull him out of his problems and danger. So that's where comes the gods. And we have always believed that the gods come and help our hands and they catch our hands and help us out. That's how religion was born. Okay, in the beginning there was fear, then there was appeasement, that if you appease the Godheads, then they will help you. There's a kind of a commerce between man and gods. Until now it lasts in most of the temples in India. There is this bargain, I give you this Godhead and you give me this. And, the most famous bargaining temple, with all due respect, is Tirupati, very close to us. And where they say, I'll shave off my head and give you all the hair, but you must give my daughter a good marriage. I'll give you my, whatever, one kilo of silver, but I want you to give me a good job to my son. All kinds of real bartering. And I must say very honestly that this barter system works wonderfully. Because there is, first of all, when you go to Tirupati, a huge big hall, not a hall, I think this is on the roadside, where there are hundreds of people sitting there with barbers, each one shaving the head of a few devotees. So most of the devotees, when they come from Tirupati, they are bald-headed. Be it both ladies or men, they have all given up their hair because they have asked the God for something to be given. It is so, I found it funny, but that's how things are. The barter system works well. I must say it's not a failure. It does work because a lot of people have succeeded in getting their sons a good job in America or Europe or a good son-in-law. That is the exchange that started taking place with man and God. And so the gods were, I would say, invented at a point, created. What I could not have, I said, hey, this Indra or X or Y, he has that aspect. If I am a bad man, the good God is called so and so. If I am not capacitated, the strong God is called Shiva. So all the human weaknesses have been hypotheticated into their extreme heights, and then they said, this is Shiva, this is this is that. So we have sort of, projected ourselves into our infinite capacity, and they said, oh, this is this God, this is this God. And well, I'm not too much out of the explanation. You will see what the mother has to say about it. So here, there begins a whole section of God. What I propose to do is, I read out a few lines and give you the tone of what Sri Aurobindo has started with his description of the gods, and then I'll take you to the mother's explanation and come back to this passage, because that's how you will be able to understand what all Sri Aurobindo is hinting at. Only the immortals on their deathless heights, dwelling beyond the walls of time and space, masters of living, free from the bonds of thought, who are overseers of fate and chance and will, and experts of the theorem of world's need, can see the idea, their might, that change time's course, come maned with light from undiscovered worlds here, while the world toils on with its deep blind heart, the galloping hoofs of the unforeseen event, bearing the superhuman rider near, and impassive to earth's din and startled cry, return to the silence of the hills of God. As lightning leaps, as thunder sweeps, they pass and leave their mark on the trampled breast of life. Above the world creators stand. In the phenomenon see its mystic source. These heed not the deceiving outward play. They turn not to the moment's busy tramp, but listen with the still patience of the unborn for the slow footsteps of far destiny, approaching through huge distances of time, unmarked by the eye that sees effect and cause, unheard with the clamor of the human plain. Attentive to an unseen truth, they seize a sound as of invisible augur wings, voices of an unplumbed significance, mutterings that brood in the core of matter's sleep. Well, basically, I'm not getting into the detail, but the impression you get here is one thought that I would like to expand a little is this question of who are overseers of fate and chance and will. And then that is, who are these overseers? Normally we immediately say the gods. But are the so-called gods overseers? In what sense? And Sri Aurobindo uses the word not helpers, not those godheads who are really coming to help mankind in its trouble, in its troubles. One is he calls them overseers, and of course there's a little passage which describes about the avatar, the Kalki avatar even, and then we have these godheads who heed not the deceiving outward play, they turn not to the moment's busy tramp. That means the human beings, they hardly have any connections, and then but they have what? Attentive to an unseen truth, they seize a sound as of invisible augur wings. So what is the main business of these gods? Is it to help man and mankind and earth? Or is it to help in the evolution of the human consciousness? And who are these overseers? Why are they called overseers? What is their position? So there are this couple of these questions which I would like to take up. But first let me give you something from the mother. This is in volume 15 of the mother's works. No, not volume 15. I'd like to go to let me start with the volume 15 on page 14 and 15. There are a few question answers from page 14 and 15 in volume 15 of the mother's works. Those who still believe in gods can certainly continue to worship them if they feel like it. But they must know that this creed and this worship has nothing to do with the teaching of Sri Aurobindo and no connection whatever with the supramental realization. You see, there were in those early days of the ashram a big psychological problem as to if we should leave the gods or we should stop worshipping the gods. And in India as elsewhere, there are plenty of pujas, and every puja we have some god or the goddess to whom the worship is given. And a lot of the Indian families who turned to Mother and Sri Aurobindo were deeply rooted in these pujas and these ceremonies and with these gods. And the way they dealt with this belief was really marvelous, I must say. In the sense, on one side, Mother tells us that Those who still believe in gods can certainly continue to worship them if they feel like it. So she didn't put a stop saying, no, you should not go back to your gods and goddesses, stop all your pujas. She said, if you want to, go ahead. But be conscious that this worship has nothing to do with the teaching of Sri Aurobindo and no connection whatever with the supramental realization. So it is a question of your feeling your need. Sometimes we are so connected or so rooted in our culture that we feel even guilty, and then you are even afraid that if you don't do this puja, what will happen? Durga may be angry with me, Krishna may be angry with me. So the original fear of the gods comes back when you leave the past worship. So Mother gave the freedom. She said, if you want to, go ahead. Well, there is an interesting question, not because I brought this question up. It was in 1969, 9th November. I was still I just finished my higher course. But I had also the same question about these pujas and these festivals. So I wrote a letter to the Mother, which is given on this page 14. What is the origin, significance and purpose of festivals such as Deepavali, Dasara, Rakhi Purnima, etc., and also some of the Western festivals? On these days, do the gods respond more to human aspiration? Thirdly, what is the connection between the inner truth and the external functions of these festivals? Lastly, what should be our attitude toward these festivals? Such a long question, and Mother gives the answer in 3 words. She says, men like festivals. So don't go into all the significance, symbolism and all that. So I still remember we had a good laugh at the whole thing. So men like festivals. So now don't make too much out of this, Even in India you will see when Diwali comes, Dasara comes, our newspapers, TV, they're full of programs, and when Christmas comes, everything is full of all these things. And then I did not leave the question there. I discovered it myself. On 21st November, that means just about 10 days, 11 days later, I write another question. As an answer to my letter on the significance of festivals, you wrote to me, men like festivals. Does it then mean that they are men's fancy and whim? Have they no meaning and no utility? Mother, it is men who give a meaning to festivals in order to legitimate their presence. We start giving interpretation, symbolism. So we legitimize the existence of the gods. Because we say, no, on this day this god comes down. But on the other side, very early in those 1930s or even 20s, in the beginning there used to be a lot of Bengali devotees. And as you know, Bengalis are very attached to Durga Puja. In the month of October. They save all their monies for this October festival, when they have new dresses and a lot of food and fun and frolic, and they make huge statues of Durga, and nowadays it's become a big competition, commercial competition. Who can make a better statue? Somebody makes them with glass, somebody with leaves, somebody with flowers, somebody in bronze, somebody in clay. And there are all the fancy things that have come up, which were not there when I was a child. There used to be the one traditional Durga with a white face and with the 10 hands. But now it's competition. So those early days, in 30s or 40s, I don't know when, a lady, she went to Mother and Sri Aurobindo, she said, Durga Puja is coming and I need to go back to Calcutta to celebrate that, to do the puja. So the Mother, Sri Aurobindo, she said, no, for the puja you don't have to go to Calcutta. you can perform the puja here. You see the flexibility, it's really incredible. Not only that, the mother and Sri Aurobindo sat in two chairs and they asked the lady to wash their feet. That's what is done in the puja. Said, we are here, we will sit down and you wash our feet, and that will be like doing your puja to Durga. So you don't have to travel all the way to Calcutta and come back. And they really did that. And the lady was happy. She did the puja, washing the feet, putting the mala and all that. You see, that was the beauty of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, of course, that they never said a no, and yet through the path of her own religion, religious belief in Durga, they led her to show her that what's important, the statue, is the devotion, the faith. And if that devotion and faith is here, we are also here. We are like your gurus, and you can wash the feet of your gurus, and that will be equal. And once again, there was another lady who was insisting on going to Calcutta, as if Calcutta, only Durga is there, only in Calcutta, because they think if you go to Gujarat or Pondicherry, Durga is not there, she is only in Calcutta. So she wanted to go there for the puja. Of course, mother didn't say anything, but on the puja day, mother used to come down near this, in the meditation hall. I'm sure, I presume that most of you have gone to meditation hall in the ashram. Near the staircase, mother used to sit. She would come down the steps and just turn right, and her chair was there. There are many documented films are also there, you can see her. So she used to sit there and distribute messages. We used to enter by Nolinidas gate, go straight in front of her, take the message, turn left, and go out of the main ashram. When this lady went to the mother on that morning, on that afternoon, that was the Durga Puja day, and she doesn't see the mother, but she sees the Durga. So mother again fulfilled her wish that she wanted to see Durga, and there she was in her Swarup, in her Roop, in her manifestation of Durga, and she blessed his devotee saying, I will give the darshan of Durga. And some other philosopher, he was reading too much of the mother and said, Mother, how can the mother have four aspects, Durga, Kali, Maheshwari, In India, to have one Durga or one Kali or one Saraswati is good enough. But here Sri Aurobindo was claiming that this mother was the incarnation, the manifestation of all the four. His philosophic mind could not really put them together. Four in one is a bit too much. So he went to the mother in her room, and again the mother, because you see, mother understands the internal reading, the doubts and debates. She doesn't speak and philosophize. She just gave the darshan of all the four deities, one after the other. Mahakali, Maheshwari, Mahalakshmi, Mahasaraswati. And then he sees this man sees right in front of her all the four aspects, one after the other, in the same physical form of this mother. I'm amazed at the way they dealt with the faith of the individual without disturbing, fulfilling, and yet transcending. And then, I don't know, Miresh will tell that why aren't you telling about your own experience? Yes, on one of the birthdays, I had no debate or questions about Durga. I said, fine. More than that, when we were children, all these gods and goddesses had no importance. Not because we did not read the mother so much, the mother, the book. But yes, we had heard about all these aspects of the mother. And yet on one of the birthdays, when I go to have her darshan, I don't see the mother at all. I see only Durga with her 10 hands, and I was looking at the Durga and where is the mother? I don't see the mother in the chair. Only she was there. Well, I don't know, the outer being must have done the pranam, the outer body must have taken the flower, the outer body walked out of the hall, the room, the chamber. Then when I was walking down, I said, surely it must have been a fancy imagination, Although I never was giving a questioning about this, I said, no, I think it must be an imagination. So I came back and had the audacity to write to her, saying that, Mother, I've seen all this morning when I came to you for darshan. Is it imagination or reality? Then Mother wrote, she says, Sans doute ati view Durga. Without any doubt, you have seen Durga. So then I said, thank you for the darshan. I never expected that. It's not the question of, because this is only to authenticate, yes. I've narrated to you about others. Yes, we did see, many of us had a darshan of Durga or the four aspects or whatever, one aspect. And yet at the same time, the importance is, as you see, this question of the festival, this question of the puja, in fact, that is what I wanted to read from another longish passage, where what she was not very much for is the question of pujas, and this is where she comes out pretty strong. I'll read out the passage. This is on from volume 6 of the Mother's Collected Works and page 194-95. Well, I think most of you have read about Mother's vision of the Notre Dame de Paris. What she sees there, the great spider and all that. I think, should I read it, or most of you have read this passage? Shall I read? Okay. This is on page 194. Regarding some Mahakali Darshan days. Yeah, this is a good start. Let's start from there. Mother, for instance, on certain days of the year, we have Lakshmi Puja, Mahakali Puja and all that. And by the way, today I was reminded that tomorrow there is Saraswati Puja. The Bengalis suddenly told me, my God, tomorrow there is Saraswati Puja. And the mother used to come in a yellow sari, so my wife is, luckily she's not there. My wife has started looking for a yellow sari for tomorrow, This is a Saraswati Puja, you must put on yellow dress. However, all these are there. So mother, she was asked on a question. Mother, for instance, on certain days of the year, we have Lakshmi Puja, Mahakali Puja and all that. And I was flabbergasted when reading this. That's because it amuses you, my children. This is the flexibility. You see, I questioned this myself so many times. Why did the mother come on these 4 days of Mahakali Puja, Lakshmi Puja, etc.? But yet, you see, as I told you in the beginning, there were 90% were Bengalis. And the Bengalis couldn't do without these pujas. As I said, somebody wanted to go back to Calcutta or have the puja come back. Their mindset was so stuck up with these pujas. So she even satisfied them, saying, okay, you don't go, I'll come on the Durga Puja days. Those who are open could see the Durga or Saraswati or Kali. But now in the conversation she says, that's because it amuses you, my children. But on these days you give us blessings also. Yes, because that amuses you. Hey? You give us blessings only to amuse us? Come now, it pleases you. I said amuses, it's okay. I was disrespectful, but because it pleases you. Amuses you, you felt insulted. The Bengalis must have had a big blow on their ego. So mother says, all right, if it is a question of amuses, if you don't like it, I'll say it is disrespectful, but it pleases you. Mahakali Day, for instance, Yes, yes. Sometimes Kali comes 3 days earlier or 4 days later or at some other time in the year. She is not necessarily there on that very day. At times, to make you happy, I call her a little. In any case, it's not I who believe in these things. I mean, well, I don't have to say, you feel for yourselves. But in all religious monuments, in monuments considered the most, well, as belonging to the highest religion, whether in France or any other country or Japan, it was never the same temples or churches, not the same gods, and yet my experience was everywhere almost the same, with very small differences. I saw that whatever concentrated force there was in the church depended exclusively upon the faith of the devotees. And there was still a difference between the force as it really was and the force as they felt it. For instance, I saw in one of the most beautiful cathedrals of France, which from the artistic point of view is one of the most magnificent monuments imaginable. In the most sacred spot, I saw an enormous black, vital spider which had made its web and spread it over the whole place and was catching in it and then absorbing all the forces emanating from people's devotion, their prayers and all that. It was not a very cheering sight. The people who were there and were praying felt a divine touch. They received all kinds of boons from their prayers, and yet what was there was this thing. But they had their faith, which could change that evil thing into something good in them. They had their faith. So truly, if I had gone and told them, do you think you are praying to God? It is an enormous vital spider that's feeding upon all your forces. That would really not have been very charitable. And that's how it is the most of the time, almost everywhere. It's a vital force which is there. For these vital entities feed upon the vibration of human emotions, and very few, an insignificant number, go to church or temple with a true religious feeling. That is, not to pray and beg for something from God, but to offer themselves, give thanks, aspire, give themselves. There's hardly 1 in a million who does that. So they do not have the power of changing the atmosphere. Perhaps when they are there, they manage to get across, break through, and go somewhere and touch something divine. But the large majority of the people who go only because of superstition, egoism, and self-interest create an atmosphere of this kind, and that's what you breathe in when you go to a church or temple. Only, as you go there with a very good feeling, you tell yourself, oh, what a quiet place for meditation. I'm sorry, but that's how it is. I tell you, I have deliberately tried this experiment a little everywhere. Maybe I found some very tiny places, like a tiny village church, or at times when there was a very quiet little spot for meditation, very still, very silent, where there was some aspiration. But this was so rare. I have seen the beautiful churches of Italy, magnificent places. They were full of these vital beings and full of terror. I remember painting in a basilica of Venice, and while I was working in the confessional, a priest was hearing the confession of a poor woman. Well, it was truly a frightful sight. I don't know what the priest was like, what his character was. He could not be seen. You know, don't you? That they are not seen, they are shut up in a box and receive the confession through a grill. There was such a dark and sucking power over him, and that poor woman was in such a state of fearful terror that it was truly painful to see that. And all these people believe this is something holy. But it is a web of the hostile vital forces which use all this to feed upon. Besides, in the invisible world, hardly any beings love to be worshipped, except those of the vital. Now this is the thing that I want to stress. In the invisible world, hardly any beings love to be worshipped, except those of the vital. These, as I said, are quite pleased by it. And then it gives them importance. They are puffed up with pride and feel very happy. And when they can get a herd of people to worship them, they are quite satisfied. But if you take real divine beings, this is not at all something they value. They do not like to be worshipped. No, it does not give them any special pleasure at all. Don't think they are happy, for they have no pride. It is because of pride that a man likes to be worshipped. If a man has no pride, he doesn't like to be worshipped. And if, for instance, they see a good intention or a fine feeling or a movement of unselfishness or enthusiasm, a joy, a spiritual joy, these things have for them an infinitely greater value than prayers and acts of worship and pujas. I assure you, what I am telling you is very serious. If you seat a real God in a chair and oblige him to remain there all the while you are doing puja, he may perhaps have a little fun watching you do it, but it certainly gives him no satisfaction. None at all. He does not feel either flattered or happy or glorified by your puja. You must get rid of that idea. There is an entire domain between the spiritual and the material worlds which belong to vital beings. And it is this domain that is full of all these things, because these beings live upon that, are happy with it. And it immediately gives them importance. And the one who has the greatest number of believers, devotees and worshippers is the happiest and the most puffed up. But how can anyone imagine that the gods could value the gods? I am speaking of the true gods, even those of the overmind. Though they are still a bit, so, they seem to have taken on many human defects, but still, despite all, they really have a higher consciousness. It does not please them at all. An act of true goodness, intelligence, unselfishness, or a subtle understanding, or a very sincere aspiration are for them infinitely higher than a small religious ceremony. Infinitely. There is no comparison. Religious ceremony. For example, there are so many of these entities called Kali who are given, besides quite terrible appearances. So many are even placed in houses as the family goddess. They are full of a terrible vital force. I knew people who were so frightened of the Kali they had at home that indeed they trembled to make the least mistake. For when catastrophes came, they thought it was Kali who sent them. It's a frightful thing. I know them, those entities. I know them very well, but they are vital beings, vital forms, which, so to say, are given a form by human thought. And what forms? And to think that men worship such terrible and monstrous things? And what's more, that these poor gods are paid the compliment of believing that it is. From this point of view, it is good that for some time men get out of this religious atmosphere, so full of fear, and this sort of blind, superstitious submission of which the hostile forces have taken a dreadful advantage. The period of denial, positivism, is from this viewpoint quite indispensable in order to free men from superstition. It is only when one comes out of that and the abject submission to monstrous vital forces that one can rise to truly spiritual heights and there become the collaborator and the true instrument of the forces of truth, the real consciousness, the true power. One must leave all this far behind before one can climb higher. So this was a very powerful thing which she talked about on 30th June 1954. So one, as we see, that's connected with the passage, is that the gods, the true gods, it does not please them at all to be worshipped. They hardly bother about us, our worship. It's only the forces below the overmind and the mind and the vital which need this kind of puja and worship and pleasing, because their ego gets puffed up and they have the importance, they feel the importance. So, and I've given it a thought in the context of Indian culture, and I've found as a solution to all this problem. Yes, India is full of such gods, I don't think any other culture has 33,000 godheads. But what happened to our spiritual culture is that there was between the gods and the human beings the spiritual gurus. So that was a very good system, I believe, that that one side there were those who went into the masses, the masses went to the pujas, the temple, the bargaining, the boons, where this question of, as the mother says, there's hardly a million who goes there to give themselves, gives their thanks. But there was the system of the Gurukulas, the ashramas, where it was not the worship that was important. We didn't worship the Guru. Yeah, we respected them. There was a lot of worshipping acts. But the innate thing was this surrender. And it is this surrender which taught them to surrender to the Godhead. You see, this true spiritual act is that of surrender. And a living master emphasized and taught them nothing but this surrender. So, as Sri Aurobindo in some, I think in synthesis somewhere he tells us that the Guru is only an external form, an occasion, a tangible form, and the Shishya, the disciple, always saw or sees or is expected to see the real divine consciousness. So when we are asked to surrender to the Guru, it is not the outer form, it is the divine within the Guru. So this led to what kind of a culture? This led to the kind of a culture of experience. You see, all the ashrams, is not that everybody in every ashram is an experienced spiritual master. But I found in Indian spirituality, these are the two trends. One was the Guru, the ashram, where there was true spirituality in essence, because there the question of surrender came in, practice came in, experience came in. So all your experiences, and you see Sri Aurobindo's, all the volumes on letters on yoga and everything, hundreds and hundreds of experiences. So the Guru was there to guide your experience. So the ashrama became a place of spiritual experience, whereas all these gods and goddesses, they came out to be a social, religious mass movement. Because, as again Sri Aurobindo explains, in evolution, everybody is not at the same level. So, the divine provides platforms for every person. So there were these masses which required this barter system with the divine. And Sri Aurobindo in the synthesis tells very firmly that this barter system is also useful. In what way? It's useful for those beginners who at least begin to depend on higher consciousness than the human. You may call it whatever you want. But at least there is the beginning of saying, "Oh Lord, oh God." This coming out of one's own ego, coming out of one's own little frame of myhood. So he says this is important because ultimately even the religious forms will tell you, I have to go beyond. There is a force beyond. So it leads you, if one is really serious about this religious business, it may lead you to a greater consciousness. But if you are not religious at all, if you are completely stark materialist, what does it mean? That you are dependent on you, yourself, your ego, your achievement, you. So that is the most anti-spiritual attitude, to be always the you. The religion is at least the you, the divine. And spirituality is completely surrendering all of myself to the divine. And the Guru was a perfect medium for this surrender. So that's why in every spiritual culture or ashram, the most important thing, the first thing that's said is surrender to your Guru. Everyone may not be the over-mental Guru or supramental Guru, some may be very ordinary Gurus. But as Sri Aurobindo again explains in the synthesis of yoga, almost in the very first, in the first introductory chapters, that you find the Guru according to your own evolution of consciousness. So your Guru is really the best passage to the divine. And you find a particular Guru because of your particular evolutionary need. So all of us, we have found Sri Aurobindo and Mother because of our own inner evolutionary need, which you and me may not be aware of mentally, but psychically there is a need for such integral vision of consciousness. And the other person has found another Guru because that is the need of that evolution of that person. So there is nothing wrong that why have we chosen X and why have we chosen Y. Each one X, Y, Z are absolutely the perfect masters in your evolutionary journey. So you may surpass the need and go to another Guru after 30 years, 20 years, 10 years. But that is no way of saying that I am betraying my Guru. Sri Aurobindo ashram has many cases where people have left their old Gurus and come to Sri Aurobindo and they are feeling guilty. Sri Aurobindo said, no, you don't have to feel guilty. It's a need. You have come to a certain level of consciousness where your Guru cannot really fulfill that, your aspiration. You change. And to some Gurus, to some disciples, he said, no, you stay back with your Guru and continue. That means your need of evolution is still there. So, however, to wrap up, so between these extremes of, the gods who do not like to be worshipped and yet we worship them, do the puja, try to please them. And there's one point, if you have noted, it says the true higher gods, they don't feel puffed and proud or pleased with your pujas. And why is it? Because they don't have the ego. So the true Godheads, these are the vital beings. Below the overmind, there are a lot of these vital beings who are full of the ego and satisfaction. They want greater the number, greater the greater. But the true gods, they don't have the ego. And then I leave you with a question. Why is it that these Godheads don't have an ego? Knowing Sri Aurobindo, you will find your answer. Because what is the ego? A reflection of what? Extension of what? If you can analyze that, then you can understand why the true gods don't have ego and why, and that is why, because they are not pleased, that's why they don't want your pujas. This is all a kind of a game. So what we are getting the description here is of that true gods, not the vital beings in between who are always trying to get something out of you. So that's the passages I wanted to bring to you. And so we will take up, now that we get an understanding of the the division, the separation of the Godheads, then the vital beings, then the gurus, importance of the ashramas. We will take up these lines again. But before I close, I think I have to announce that next Monday I'll be out of station. So 1 week we won't have class. After that, I think again on 17th we'll come back. So only next Monday, that's the 10th of Feb, I won't be taking a class. So let's have the concentration.